And so I think when things feel insurmountable to me from an environmental challenge perspective, I try to hone in a little bit more specifically on something that I could affect or help or support to drive forward.
This episode is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Tidal Influence, a Californian ecological consulting firm who proudly supports environmental education and all of the diverse conservation efforts that Pelicanus works to highlight. Visit their website at tidalinfluence.com to learn more about what they do to conserve our coastal resources and how you can get involved. On today's Conservation Conversations episode, we talk with Karina Johnston, a PhD candidate at UC Santa Barbara, a coastal habitat restoration ecologist that was with Tidal Influence, but is now the executive director of Heal the Ocean, a nonprofit in Santa Barbara, California. She has so much experience and a wealth of knowledge to share, so let's get straight to our conversation with Karina. Karina, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time. So if you don't mind, please introduce yourself. Tell us all who you are, what you do.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Karina Johnston, and I am the Senior Restoration Ecologist for Tidal Influence and a PhD candidate and graduate student researcher at the University of California, Santa Barbara in the Brin School of Environmental Science and Management.
All right.
Couple of hats.
Yeah. So I want to hear more about what we could start at the beginning and say, what is restoration ecology, and what does that, how does that translate from a day-to-day job? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's well, I'm not going to go back through all the, environmental science 101, but I think the intent is to think about some of the impacts to systems over time and either try to remove them, try to improve the health or condition of a habitat type, and try to do it in a way that has multi-benefits. So benefits to wildlife, plants, ecosystem services, but also in the context of a lot of our areas in Southern California, we need to consider, the social and human dimension too, and the urbanization. So really just trying to improve environmental health kind of holistically with a focus on different habitat types. I focus on coastal ecosystems.
So I guess that's my next question is what kind of habitats is it? Because when think coastal, you just think, oh, that's beach or rocks. And so what does that actually mean? Is there, and what do you mean by coastal? How far in? Do you go 10 miles in, 1 mile in? Is it how offshore is it? Do you go 10 miles offshore? What is the coast? I guess that's a simple question. What is the coast?
Is it a simple question? I don't know. I think that varies for everybody. I like to think about these systems comprehensively and across ecosystems. And so when you think about coastal habitats, they're not independent from each other. They're interrelated. There's important nutrient cycling and carbon and wildlife support and all of that crosses over. You can't really think about a system independently. But for me, the coast is everything from marine habitats like kelp forests and eelgrass, sandy subtidal areas, all the way up the beach, thinking about dunes, thinking about wetlands and the intersection of all of those together. And then with that kind of human element layered on top of it. So when I think about the systems and a lot of, I think, projects that are happening now are really thinking about the intersection of all of these habitat types and even more than that, how the watershed dynamics and the water kind of and sediment moving through the system flows into these coastal areas, where the sediment comes from in the littoral cell on the ocean. And yeah, it's all connected.
I think that's why I've always liked coastal ecology. One, because you get to spend time at the beach and near the beach, and it's usually a little bit nicer. but also just that everything kind of comes together. The inland meets the ocean, and it's kind of that transition zone. And whether, like you said, whether it's dunes or rocky cliffs or intertidal or whatever, those are always the more interesting locations wherever you go. You go to
Right,
the top
right.
of a mountain, that is what it is. But like where it's transitioning into the desert or the foothills on the other side, that's always where it's interesting.
Another thing I like about coastal habitats is that they're so dynamic. They're always changing, shifting. Maybe they're seasonal, maybe they're storm changes. So this kind of dynamic nature of these systems makes them super interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's that dynamic nature is why I see we as a society is considering coastal resiliency, especially in California, is, some of those impacts are from, like you said, human dimensions, or on a smaller scale, like Palisades fire, something like that,
Right.
to, development, or even longer, term, bigger picture of climate change. Like what is our coast going to look like? And so, say all that just to kind of ask, like, I guess we'll start with your work at UC Santa Barbara. So you said you're a PhD candidate. So you've done all the exams. So now you're doing mostly research, right?
Yes, yes.
Nice.
Yeah,
That's
just finishing off the last chapter of the dissertation now. So,
Tell us what your PhD program is about, and what you've studied, and where you kind of want to take that.
yeah. Well, I'll start with the short version. I'm really focused on thinking about coastal resilience, especially in urban communities, but also kind of more generally, and thinking about solutions to climate impacts like flooding, erosion, sea level rise, and what the potential adaptation solutions are for those. And so my PhD research is really focused on nature based solutions like dune or wetland restoration that help improve the resilience of our coastline to those impacts.
That nature-based solutions is kind of a hot word right now, and I find it interesting
Yes.
because, not to take this in any political way, but both sides, whatever sides mean, both sides kind of agree, because it has kind of a vagueness to it where we're like, on the ecologist side, we're like, the nature has this ability to adapt and is resilient in itself. So let's build up those structures that already exist, but make them stronger, larger, whatever. And then on the other side, they're like, yeah, we don't want to do anything. Let nature take care of it. And so it's kind of a really cool way to kind of, merge both sides, I guess, to actually
Yeah.
get some cool work done.
Yeah. I think one of the things that everybody can agree on across, any spectrum of evaluation is that we really want to protect our coastal communities from flooding and some of the impacts that are associated with that. And so if we can take an approach like a nature-based approach that provides multiple benefits in addition to these protection benefits that we're looking for these coastal communities, then it's a win-win across the board, right? And the other aspect of that is that a lot of them are, you have this potential to also integrate recreation, and which we know is a really important part of coastal communities, especially in Southern California, but anywhere really. And so I think, these types of approaches can integrate all of those components. Whereas when you think about protective structures in an infrastructure capacity, like we've sort of done historically, seawalls or things of that nature, you really limit the ability to get all of those benefits out of those types of structures.
Yeah, and I know in the past, and I don't know currently, but I'm hoping we can talk about it. Is I know Tidal Influence has been uh, involved in local dune restoration, and dune, I wouldn't say is the word construction, maybe, or the dune, building up the dunes and developing it. And so I guess, okay, so talking about nature-based solutions and dunes, is it kind of a thing where, like we talked about with the dunes are dynamic, but if you plant, so you're on a beach and you want to restore a dune, can you physically put up fences or plant native dune plants, and then the sand will kind of build itself up into like it's a more like what you think of as a dune, or is it kind of, I don't know what my question is, but maybe that's the
No,
that
no,
is the
I can speak to that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what we have now is these great examples of pilot demonstration projects. There's a number of them in Southern California, and Tidal Influence has been part of a number of them. The nonprofit that I was with formerly in Los Angeles, the Bay Foundation, we put in a number of them, and so and they still are. And so one of the things that, we're looking at, and part of my PhD research is looking at, is how do these systems respond once you restore them or kind of remove the impacts. And there's a couple of different categories of restoration. There's some that where you remove an invasive species like European beach grass or ice plant, and you replace it with a native species, and then that sort of allows that system to respond and recover. And then there are other examples, and this is especially notable in Southern California. There's a few pilot projects and demonstration projects where you remove a disturbance like grooming or raking the beach. And then the system can recover actually quite well with minimal intervention. So sometimes there's sand fencing, sometimes there's other methods of trapping and slowing down the sand from moving across the beach and collecting it in one place. And sometimes, it's just, stopping the disturbance and adding some native plant seeds, and then the system can actually recover. And over time, you get the formation, whether or not you're using restoration elements like sand fencing or other elements, or you're using native plants. There's a lot of species like red sand verbena is really common in California as a four dune species, a species kind of close to the ocean that's really great at forming dunes that are protective in this kind of beach dune interface. And they have this kind of cup-shaped succulent leaf that also has sticky parts on it. And it's great at slowing the sand down, through wind movement, but also through just physically catching and trapping it. And over time, you form this small sand mound plant hummock that then triggers the plant to grow on top of itself and shoot more leaves up, which then allows more accretion of sand, and then you get this sort of pattern over time of a small dune forming. And then that, has the potential to get larger and larger, depending on where your sand supply and your wind and all these other physical factors too.
So you're working on your PhD, and you've got the coastal resiliency and dune research, and you've got, like you said, you have a few publications you've already put out. How does that translate to your work at Tidal Influence, where is it just another avenue to do more research, or is it kind of like putting that research into action? Or I guess, that's one
Yeah.
question, but then also where do you want to take the doctorate that you're about to hopefully get?
Yeah. No, great questions. When I think about science, it's in a very applied way. And by that, I mean, what's the intersection between science and action? And is it this, using one to inform the other? I believe it's this kind of big Venn diagram that's all jumbled up. But in the middle of it is, change and projects moving forward. And so we have, to inform these types of projects and programs. And then we have actions that we can take, like implementing restoration projects, understanding from those that can also be driven by research that can then inform policy and guidance, whether that's at a state level or higher. And so I think there's this really neat nexus between what I'm researching with UCSB and as part of the PhD program and implementing these types of projects in action through my work at Tidal Influence and our work at Tidal Influence. And so, it's really neat. We've got a number of different dune restoration projects, but also looking at the intersection of dunes and coastal wetland habitats. And we've talked, quite a bit at the beginning about how those habitat types are interconnected and ecosystems are interconnected. And so one of the things that I love is having this, research drive the understanding of these systems and then practically applying it by implementing the projects in the field. And that's my sweet spot. That's where I love the kind of intersection of those elements. And so Tidal Influence has a number of restoration projects, dune restoration projects, wetland restoration projects. One of our biggest projects is the Southern Los Cerritos Wetlands Restoration Project right now, which is really exciting. Covers a whole range of habitat types and coastal ecosystem intersections. So I love being able to kind of practically apply it and get my hands dirty, literally in the field.
Yeah, that project, the Los Cerritos Wetlands project, is fascinating to me because of, like you said, it's just a wide variety of different habitats that need to be restored. One, two, it's old oil land. So it's how do we transition away from this, or how do we keep the oil operations, but then kind of shrink them down into whatever location they need, but then whatever habitat they had roads on or infrastructure, that can now be habitat with trails and, like you said, for rec. But also it's crazy urban. It's surrounded by houses and literally power plants. And that's definitely something we'll have to follow up with you or Eric at Tidal Influence. And like, as that project moves forward, how do we see how that's actually working? Because it's such a fascinating, interesting project. And so for you guys, are you kind of involved with the planning of restoration and then actually going to hopefully be involved with the doing it?
Yeah, we are. We're managing the project, supporting the Los Cerritos Wetlands Authority. It's a big team of folks. Everyone from land management entities to restoration ecologists to engineers to outreach specialists. So whole big team of folks that kind of come together and put their brains together to work on the design. But we're really hopeful that that's a project that moves forward in the near future. We're at the end stages of the design process right now, and looking forward to seeing these habitats change for the better over time.
It's exciting because it feels like that's a project that's just kicking off, but it's just been kicking off for the last 25 years.
Yeah, there's no change takes time, and major projects take major investments and time and effort, and also this sort of culture shift of people thinking about a system in a different way. And so when we have a lot of these Southern California coastal systems, you really can't think about them ecologically independently from the social dynamics and the human dynamics and the intersection. In some cases, like Los Cerritos, we've got 150 years of industrial use of the site and infrastructure and development and, alteration of the system. And so we really want to think about it in the context of, okay, how can we maximize benefits to the environment, biodiversity, and also people?
Yeah, and it's in such a like I said earlier, an interesting area where it crosses two counties. It's hyper urban, and I'll throw a map up on the screen to show what it actually looks like, and then I know there's some publications on what potentially the design could look like, so I can put that up there as well. But it has the potential. Well, it already is a bit of a safe haven for a lot of species that
Hmm.
are migratory, or just kind of this is the last bastion of their habitat. But with restoration and a lot of work, it really could be a crucial spot for a lot of these species and habitats, then just to kind of keep them going into the next 150 years.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about habitat loss, and dune loss, and certainly I think that extends to coastal wetland systems as well. Southern California has lost the vast majority of those systems, and I think the ones that we have left, we have to protect, conserve, but also restore where we can to maximize the areas that are left for these species, but also for people to understand them, in a in systems in LA and in Orange County. Then there's a real opportunity here to have people engage with and learn from these systems too. Um, One of the stories that I love to talk about is having outreach events for various dune restoration projects, and how when we first started the programs for dune restorations in LA County, it was hard to it was almost a culture shift for people to understand that plants could grow on a beach. And so that's kind of ties back into what I was saying with these projects take time. That culture shift takes time, and then the ways that people can interact and enjoy them also grows over time.
And I think what's also cool about that, with you said it takes time, and there's been almost like a generation of people in these positions, like I said, across cities, across counties, across all these different jurisdictions, but also communities. And over the last 20 plus years, it's actually still going on, and the project is happening. And so that just shows that it's something that the community and we as a society, or we as an organization, or whatever you want to call it, in Southern California, is something we want, because it's not going to happen if not enough people want it, because it's going to be millions and millions of dollars. And that's what's so cool about it, is it's a bunch of people from different backgrounds, different objectives, and different uh, biases are all coming together to build something fun for the community, for species, for all different reasons. And that's why I think is such a cool project, along with all the rest of these kind of restoration and management projects along the coast. Colorado Lagoon, we've talked about a bunch on here. It's another one that's
Yeah.
actually that's at the end stages of its restoration, so
Right.
it's pretty
Right.
cool.
Yeah, I think all of these systems. Los Ritos is a good example of something that's had a long planning timeline and horizon. But I think when you're thinking about any urban system, whether it's for habitat restoration, to improve resilience, species protection, or benefits, or some factor of all of the above, um, you know, building consensus around a project and planning for something of that scale and magnitude takes time. And so, millions of people live and recreate along the coast, and so we have to kind of factor all of those into these planning efforts. But Los Rios is great. Tidal Influence has been part of it for many years, and it's just really exciting to see it all coming together.
And that's what's so wild about your profession is you're a restoration ecologist, so it kind of sounds like, oh, I just study plants and habitats, but now you're also working about policy and laws, and how to influence communities, and how to get it's just like it's multifaceted. It's not just looking at plants and animals. That's what's so
I
wild
mean,
about it.
yeah, I mean, I love looking at plants and animals, and that's why I got into it. But I think you have to think about the intersection of all of these things if you want to really have effective change in a positive direction. So,
And we've talked about this before, but I think that's one of the reasons why I love Southern California, and that's, it's a conservation, or sorry, a biodiversity hotspot, because you go from the beach, even just like a couple miles off the beach, all the way, 200, 250 miles in, there's dozens and dozens of different types of ecosystems and habitats, and just seeing how they all interact with each other in a natural way is already interesting enough. But then you throw in all the stressors of development and toxic substances and climate change and sea level rise. Like, there's just like, you got good job security, you got plenty of stuff to study. I guess to kind of build off that idea of this just being such a interesting area for a lot of different reasons, what was it that got you into this? Did you grow up in the dunes? Did you not, obviously you didn't grow up on the dunes, but did you, like, where did you grow up, and what brought you to this field in general, but also just more specifically to coastal resiliency work?
yeah, yeah. Well, I didn't grow up in a dune, so I mean, that's too bad. But I've always loved the coastlines and oceans and the intersections of the environment and people since I was a kid. I actually was born in Texas, uh, and knew early on in my life that I wanted to be a marine biologist. And so it was, I've been striving kind of, I think, since I was 7 or 8, sort of towards that career path. I convinced my parents, and my dad actually did this with me, but I convinced them when I was 12 that I needed to get scuba certified. And so I got my junior open water certification. I remember the first time I put a regulator in my mouth and went underwater and could breathe underwater in a pool, and my life changed, right? And so I knew that if that was something that I could do for the rest of my life, I would be happy. But as my career progressed, I realized that even more than my love of the ocean and organisms and wildlife and kind of wanting to make a difference in positive environmental change, I was also really interested in this intersection between people and place, and the environment and people. And I think I started to think about coastal systems not being independent, not just being something that we should restore for just the sake of the wildlife and the plants that would benefit from them, but also, how we can use some of the services that they provide, like improved resilience and protection, as a communication point to get other people interested that maybe maybe we don't, maybe your favorite animal isn't also my favorite animal, but we can all agree that we would like more protection for our coastline, and also for it to be beautiful and somewhere we can still recreate. So that evolved into kind of finding a middle ground, and then kind of really started getting into this concept of resilience and nature-based solutions for this, like wetland and dune restoration, in it's 10 or 15 years ago.
And I think that's a good point, because as ecologists, we kind of think of, you know, things need to be restored, things need to be protected just because they are there, and they have an intrinsic value.
Right.
But that's not how everyone thinks. For, like you just said, there is a human dimension aspect to all of this, where it's not just, hey, we're saving this bird. It's like, we're saving this habitat because it could help with flooding, could help with any kind of toxic substance mitigation. There's a lot of different reasons why we need these for our everyday lives, as we've seen with an increase of natural disasters from fire. We had our first hurricane a couple of years ago in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of different aspects to it, and I think that's a really important thing, that you just mentioned, but also one of the reasons why you kind of took that turn in in your career. And so I just kind of wanted to mention that because I think it is easy to kind of get lost in like, how do these polychaete worms interact with this type of, mud substrate? And it's like, that's really cool. And that's really important. I like reading those things, but also like, how does it relate to everyday life for people that are just
Yeah.
trying to go to Trader Joe's,
Yeah. And sometimes it's hard because it's easier for people to connect with a species if it's cute or charismatic or fluffy or something. But I think when you connect at all, and sometimes those species can be great because they provide this sort of umbrella protection, and get people to be focused on an area or a habitat. But in other ways, I think it's just really important to connect the reasons and drivers and motivations for a lot of these projects with the outcomes and potential benefits. And I think that's where you can find something for everybody.
And I mean, everyone that watches the news or stays informed knows that there's no shortage of reasons to be pessimistic. There's no shortage of reasons to be worried about the state of the world in the future. But, one of one of the things we like to highlight is that all this great work is happening every day by organizations at every different level. And so you can't do that without some sort of hope in the
Yeah.
future that what you're
Yeah.
doing is going to be meaningful and actually make some change that you want to see. So what is it that gives you that hope, and what is it gives you that drive, that optimism, or we call it possibilism? What is it that flips that switch for you to keep going?
Yeah, this is a great question because when you think about environmental problems and challenges, it can feel sometimes insurmountable because it's just a little bit overwhelming. And I used to teach, and I would have students come up to me and say, "I am overwhelmed by climate change. I don't. How are we ever going to solve this global, you know, incredibly impactful problem?" And I would say I like to think about it that small changes drive larger changes. And so all of the small changes are important. But I also think it's really important to, maintain that hope by thinking through a targeted, specific problem that you'd like to solve. Right. And if, everybody I knew kind of came together, we couldn't still individually solve a problem like climate change. But what we can do is think through different types of solutions for specific impacts or disturbances or disasters or things like that. And so I think what I find inspiration in and what I find hope in is that you can make a difference with small changes, and you can focus in on a problem and really try to solve that one. And so for me, that's, sandy shoreline flooding and coastal erosion, right? There are solutions to this, and we can work together to make that happen. And one of the other reasons I feel an incredible amount of hope and optimism for the future in that regard is that the progression, even over the last 10 or 15 years, of how people are talking about this, how the awareness has improved, and how we've seen the success of these demonstration projects and pilot projects, and the potential for scalability is really high. And so that trajectory to me is really positive. And so I think when things feel insurmountable to me from an environmental challenge perspective, I try to hone in a little bit more specifically on something that I could affect or help or support to drive forward.
I'm sold. Everything's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the last question we ask everybody now is, along those same lines, is how do people get involved? Like how do they, whether it's with your organizations, your school, your local area, or just in general, like you said, figure out how you can actually do something to help. Like, what is your advice on how to get people involved with your work or beyond?
Yeah, well, I love this question. How to get involved, how to be, how to make a difference. I think, when you think about it, it's all different scales, right? So I think every change that you can make or support that is, has positive benefits for the environment, that's special and important and should be valued. And, my son gets really excited when he picks up trash and is like, I'm making the environment less dirty. And, I think everything from small scale efforts all the way up are really important. So I'm a firm believer that anything you can do to try to help is fantastic. I think it's important to get involved with your local community. So no matter where you are, there's probably some group or entity doing, beach cleanups or trash pickups or park, work on putting more plants in or trees so all of those are I think tangible. Getting involved with, universities can be great. Students can help out on different projects, different research or restoration projects. Tidal Influence has a ton of different volunteer events. So you can always, check out the Tidal Influence website, and there's lots of opportunities to get involved. I think we've got multiple programs that have that potential for you to, get involved, plant a native plant, learn more about the wetlands, learn more about these coastal systems. So.
Yeah, that's so cool because, like I say, if you don't live in Southern California or the coast of Southern California, it's okay because, like you said, there's usually an organization that's doing something similar or something that you want to be a part of. And that's what, again, that's what's
and
so
when
cool.
people are doing things in their area, in their local community, they're already connected to it, right? And so that kind of drives forward that motivation. I think you're really helping your area. And so anyway, yeah.
Well, Karina, thank you so much for joining us. That was fantastic, and we loved hearing about what you're studying and how you're putting that into action. And hopefully we can follow up with you in the next few years and hear how that's going, and you'll be a doctor.
We'll see. I hope so. Yeah. No, thank you so much for the time. This has been really great, and it's super interesting to have these conversations. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
Fantastic. Thank you again to Karina for taking the time to talk with us. It's the work that she does that can really give us hope for the future of the California coastline. So please check out the website for Tidal Influence or even Heal the Ocean and get involved with either of them to do whatever you can to help. Host and producer is Austin Parker. Music was provided by A Picture Book Studio. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you want to help. Thanks again. We'll talk to you next time.